Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your Soviet Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance in the eastern outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions, to the north of Pokrovsk, in the vicinity of Siversk and Lyman, where the most aggressive Russian offensive operations are taking place, and in the Kharkiv region, both on the eastern and western banks of the Encircle river line in the direction of Kupyansk and Borova. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians made significant advances within Kupyansk yet again, gaining control over the southern parts of the residential area, where they have managed to reach the outskirts of the apartment complex area in the central and southern parts of the city. The Russians have also managed to infiltrate deep into the industrial area and through the apartment complex area in the northern parts and central parts of the city. With this, the southwestern road has been physically cut off, leaving just the southern road to resupply the Ukrainian forces within Kupyansk, and putting the entire central grouping of Ukrainian forces within Kupyansk in an operational encirclement, where the Russians have control over the three flanks and have fire control over the southern road, not through direct fire or physical control, but through drone operations, artillery, and reconnaissance. The Russians also have close fire, direct fire control over the railway area through the presence in the industrial area and the apartment complex area that is contesting the supply lines, which means that it is difficult for the Ukrainians to properly resupply their forces because Russian DRG units are operating within those supply lines. With these developments, the Russians are just one step away from gaining full control over the western parts of Kupyansk, and that one step is put into three different parts: the northern, central, and southern defensive positions of the Ukrainians, which are the southern apartment complex area, the northern apartment complex area, and the apartment complex into industrial area in the central parts. The Russians are here isolating the western parts of Kupyansk from the eastern parts, and also cutting off the main supply lines to resupply their forces in the area. This does not just have an effect at Kupyansk itself, but also on the entire pocket east of Kupyansk, where the Ukrainians still have a significant presence from Petropavlivka in the north to Hlushkivka in the south. Moving south to the Borova direction, the Russians have managed to gain control over some fortified positions. As we see with this geolocated footage, the Russians have pushed through beyond Selenya High and are now fighting over the fortified positions on the eastern flank of Voriska and Rivka. With the capture of these fortified positions, the Russians are now slowly pushing through to the fortified positions in the south and to enter into the settlement itself, where they already have control over the northern flank and now also have control over the western flank. This comes following the initial push in the northern direction to gain control over the fortified positions along the defensive line here to the north of Novoplatonivka. The Russians are here developing offensive operations in the vicinity of Borova, while we're seeing the developments taking place in the Kupyansk direction. Based on this, we can see that there's a clear intention by the Russian forces to not just gain control over Kupyansk and the eastern section, but also currently activating offensive operations to gain control over a wider area here in the vicinity of Sinkove, potentially to push across the Encircle river line. At the same time, with this developments, the Russians are now pushing through the first line of defense east of Borova, which is flanking the road between Stepi and Kupenki in the north to Novy Emir and Ridkodub and Nova in the south. The road that is connecting the northern and southern parts is overlooked by the fortified positions here on the northern flank of it and facing fortifications in the southern flank, which the Ukrainians have control of. This limits the Russian capability to gain control over the northern and southern flanks and connect the two roads to connect all of their positions on the western bank of the Cherevets river line, strengthening the logistics of the forces on the western bank. Gaining control over the fortified positions by attacking them from the flank and the rear allows them to take advantage by attacking the weak point of these fortifications, and at the same time to gain control over the fortifications overlooking the road connecting the two sides, allowing them to strengthen the logistics of their forces here to the east of Borova, and also to breach the second line of defense and reach into the core of Borova. Meanwhile, the Russians continued offensive operations both to the east of Lyman and the north of Siversk. To the east of Lyman, the Russians have managed to secure the southern parts of Sarezhne, gaining full control over Sarezhne itself, while the fortified positions on the outskirts of Sarezhne remains under Ukrainian control. What we're seeing is that the Russians are now pressuring the Ukrainian positions outside of the settlement itself to gain control over the fortifications and reach deeper towards Lyman. The Russians are just a few kilometers from Lyman itself with the capture of Sarezhne and have a steady foothold across the Sherebets River line. At the same time, they're pushing across the Sherebets River line through the Serbiansky forest area, where they can connect their forces in Yampil with the forces in Sarezhne by pushing along the railway area and expanding their foothold across the Sherebets River line. While at the same time, we see that fighting is taking place in the vicinity of Mirne, the northern flank of Sarezhne, and south of Glydiasi, where the Russian forces are looking to encircle the Ukrainian forces and close the pocket, which will allow them to connect their forces in the northern flank of Sarezhne. Gaining control of the fortifications on the outskirts of Sarezhne will strengthen that position. It will also allow the Russians to increase the forces that are building up within Sarezhne on the eastern flank of Lyman, gaining control over Yampil in the future. Solidifying their positions along Sarezhne and the western bank of the Sherebets River line will allow the Russians to start offensive operations towards Lyman itself, this southern highway that connects in the direction of Siversk, and to flank the fortified defensive lines of the Ukrainians north of Lyman from the eastern flank, while positional fighting in Novoselivka, Borova, and Dobresheve in the north will allow the Russians to flank the fortified positions from the western direction as well, and then to infiltrate into the city from the weak points of the defensive positions and fortifications of the Ukrainians in the area. The Russians have also managed to gain control over the western flank of Serbianka by pushing through the Serbiansky forest area into the Donetsk region, gaining control over the residential area near the Dreamwood area, and then to gain full control over the northern bank of Bakhmutovka River. With this, the supply connection to the Ukrainian forces in the fortified positions are completely cut off, and it's only a matter of days, if not hours, before the Russians gain full control over the northern fortifications as well, which will allow them to gain full control over the northern flank of Siversk, to expand their offensive operations into Siversk itself from the northern flank and the flank of the fortifications facing the eastern direction. At the same time, the Russians continue advances to the north of Vyemke in the southern flank of Siversk along the eastern railway connection, where they are getting closer to the fortifications of the Ukrainians, acting as an outpost on the southern flank of Siversk to prevent a Russian force reaching the town itself. So we're seeing the Russians advancing in the northern and southern flanks of Siversk, while they're also advancing in the eastern and western flanks of Lyman, as they continue offensive operations to gain control over both of these areas, where the fighting has been raging for the past 3 years. In the Pokrovsk direction to the north of the city, the Russians are continuing their positional fighting here in the northern direction, where they've managed to gain control over the southern bank of the reservoir. The Russians have aligned the front line with the river line here from Poltavka in the south all the way to the north. This allowed the Russians to strengthen their positions on the eastern flank and concentrate their forces in the northwestern direction towards Sofievka and Shekhov from the eastern flank, where the objective is to cut off the supply lines to the Ukrainian forces operating within Pankivka, Novotoretsk, and Volodymyrivka in the south. This would allow the Russians to then cut off the supply lines, weakening their offensive operations, and regain control over the flanks to support their forces operating here in the north to prevent a Ukrainian encirclement of Russian forces, where the Russian forces were operationally encircled, but now they've managed to capture Dorozhne, reversing the situation on the Ukrainians here in the northern flank. As for the eastern outskirts of the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians continued offensive operations here to the northwest of Stepove, where they're fighting over the remaining fortifications here along the anti-tank Daichi Centrangitis lines, where they are continuing offensive operations both on the northern and southern bank of the river line and the fortifications. Gaining control over the fortifications themselves allows for a secure passage of Russian forces, as well as control over the road itself, while it does not allow them to pass through these fortifications themselves until they have gained full control of the area and the crossing here along the river line, which then leads into Oleksivka in the north, where they can start the offensive operations on the settlements here to the south of the Warfare River line and north of the remaining fortifications, allowing them to bypass the last remaining fortifications here on the northern flank of this defensive line. From these developments all across the front line, we can see that the Russians are making significant progress within the Donetsk region, as well as along the defensive lines of the Ukrainians and in the Kharkiv region as well. The Russians' continued offensive operations centered around the fortifications and the defensive positions of the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians continue building the next lines of defense following the next one whenever the Russians continue advancing. But as geographical barriers disappear and the fortifications are more rushed, the Russian offensive operations will lead to a faster pace and more Ukrainian losses, as they're not able to match the quality of the defensive fortifications they have available within the Donetsk region. Therefore, time is not playing in favor of the Ukrainians as the Russians continue offensive operations for now almost the second year in a row. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.